She built her bed inside the stove wall, while the first frost cracked the puddles in the wagon road, and every settler with sense was racing to seal the last gaps before snow flew. Elizabeth Miller, 43 years old, widowed 5 months, stood alone on a borrowed scaffold of sawhorses and pine planks, prying field stones from the chimney she and her husband had laid 3 summers past. The neighbors slowed their wagons to watch. They saw her hauling each stone down, numbering it with chalk, arranging the pieces on canvas in the exact pattern they'd occupied in the masonry. By the second week, they'd given her a name that carried through the valley like smoke, the Chimney Woman. They said grief had taken her wits. They said no decent person tore down a working flue when winter came howling. They did not know she'd already buried 1 child because a house stayed cold. Pine Valley, Wisconsin, autumn 1872. The township sat in a crease of land where the river bent west, and the Norwegian families had claimed their quarter sections on faith and cleared timber. Most had come from coastal districts where peat burned slow and houses crouched low against Atlantic gales. They built their American cabins tall, proud, with room for a family to stand upright, and a stove to push heat through air that moved freely from wall to wall. Elizabeth had come from higher country, from Telemark, where January cold dropped to 30 below, and a child who slept in open air did not wake. She remembered what the valley had forgotten. The day Richard Clark came with the promissory note, Elizabeth was halfway through dismantling the chimney's south face. He rode up in a buckboard, dust rising from the wheel ruts, a leather case tucked under one arm. She did not stop working. The mallet rang against stone, the sound sharp in the still air. Mrs. Miller. He stepped down, brushed his coat. I regret the timing. Elizabeth set the mallet on the plank, wiped mortar dust from her palms. Your late husband borrowed $300 from my mill last spring. For equipment, I believe. The note comes due in 2 years. He opened the case, withdrew a paper with Robert Williams' signature inked across the bottom. If you cannot repay by September 1874, the land reverts to satisfy the debt. The words settled like stones. Elizabeth took the paper, scanned the terms. Robert had needed a better plow, a harrow that wouldn't snap in root-thick soil. He'd planned to repay from the harvest. He had not planned to die of pleurisy with the corn still green. 2 years. Generous, I think, given the circumstances. A widow alone, with no steady income. Clark's voice carried the oiled sympathy of a man accustomed to foreclosures. If you'd prefer to settle now, I can offer $200 for the land. Clean break. You could return to family in Norway. Elizabeth folded the note, slipped it into her apron pocket. I have family here now. Do you? Clark glanced at the dismantled chimney, the numbered stones, the scaffold that swayed when the wind came up. Forgive me, but I see a woman tearing down her only source of heat before winter. That doesn't suggest. Stable judgment. Your concern is noted, Mr. Clark. I'll have your money in 2 years. Mrs. Miller, be realistic. How will you farm this land alone? How will you even survive the cold? His hand swept toward the chimney. Whatever you're building here, it won't keep you alive when the temperature drops to 40 below. She picked up the mallet again, the weight familiar in her grip. If I die, Mr. Clark, the land passes to my sister's child in Norway. You'll get nothing, so perhaps you should hope I live. His mouth tightened. He returned the case to the buckboard, climbed up, took the reins. I'll return in 74. We'll see what's left of you then. The wagon rolled away. Elizabeth turned back to the chimney, to the work that would either save her or prove Clark right. She did not let her hands shake until he was gone from sight. 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1869, her daughter Emily had died in this house at 5 years old. Scarlet fever, the doctor said, though by the time he'd ridden out from the river settlement, the child's skin had already cooled. Elizabeth remembered the morning with a clarity that never softened. Robert building up the fire at dawn, the stove glowing red, the main room reaching perhaps 50 degrees, while outside the thermometer read 12 below. Emily's bedroom, partitioned off by a thin pine wall, had stayed colder. The girl had shivered through the night, and sometime before sunrise her small body had simply stopped fighting. When Elizabeth found her, frost had formed on the inside of the window above the bed, a delicate lattice of ice that caught the early light. Beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. They buried her under the lone bur oak at the field's edge, next to a stillborn son from the first year of the marriage. Robert had wept openly at the graveside, his shoulders heaving, his voice breaking on the Lutheran hymns. Elizabeth had stood silent, her face set, her hands folded. She did not cry until 3 weeks later, alone in the cabin, when she found Emily's rag doll wedged behind the butter churn. Then the grief came like a flood, and when it receded, it left behind a sediment of cold rage. Never again. Robert died in April 1872, coughing blood into a basin while spring rain drummed on the roof. Pleurisy, caught after a day mending fences in wet clothes. Elizabeth nursed him for 10 days, dosing him with willow bark tea and mustard plasters, sitting up through the nights while he struggled for breath. He died at dawn on a Thursday, his hand going slack in hers, his eyes still open. She closed them gently, washed his body, dressed him in his good wool suit. The funeral drew half the valley. Kenneth Thompson, who owned the general store, wept as they lowered the coffin. Patricia Anderson, wife of the wealthiest landowner in the township, brought a casserole and a look of distant pity. Elizabeth accepted both without comment. The letter from Norway arrived the same week. Her younger sister, Astrid, had died in childbirth, the baby stillborn, leaving behind a 4-year-old daughter named Amanda. No husband, no family willing to take the girl. The parish was prepared to place her in an orphanage unless Elizabeth could provide passage and guardianship. Elizabeth read the letter twice, then wrote her reply immediately. Send the child. She enclosed $20 for the voyage and went to Kenneth Thompson's store to wire the rest. Amanda arrived in June on a wagon from the river settlement, a tiny figure in a gray dress too large for her frame, carrying a carpet bag and a wooden doll with a painted face. She spoke no English. Her eyes, pale blue and solemn, took in the cabin, the fields, the chimney Elizabeth was already dismantling, and she said nothing. Elizabeth knelt in the dust, took the child's hands, spoke in Norwegian. You are safe here. You are home. Amanda's chin trembled. Mama's in heaven? Yes. Will you go to heaven too? Elizabeth pulled the girl close, felt the small body stiffen, then slowly relax. Not for a long time. I'm going to make sure you stay warm. The promise felt like an oath sworn over graves. That night, Elizabeth opened the leather-bound notebook her father had given her before she left Telemark. He'd been a stonemason, 3rd generation, trained in the old methods of building pismer, the central stone hearth that anchored a Norwegian mountain home. The notebook contained his life's work, measured drawings of smoke channels, calculations for thermal mass, sketches of the Singe Cove, the sleeping cupboard built directly into the chimney's flank, where the youngest child or the eldest grandparent slept on the bitterest nights. Her father had written in New Norsk, the old script, cramped and precise, for små barn I hard winter. Stein hugsa, tre gloimer, for small children in hard winter. Stone remembers. Wood forgets. Elizabeth had slept in such a cupboard as a girl of 7, the winter her mother died. She remembered the warmth of the masonry against her back, the way the heat soaked through her nightdress, the feeling that the house itself was holding her. The American cabins had no such provision. They relied on air, on continuous fire, on hope. When the fire faltered, the air turned to ice. She would not trust air again. The work consumed the summer. She started by expanding the chimney's south face, adding 16 inches of masonry to create the mass she needed. The stones came from the same field where Robert had gathered them, glacial granite heavy as sin, each one requiring both hands to lift. She worked alone, hauling stone in a wheelbarrow, mixing mortar in a wooden trough, laying courses with a level and patience learned at her father's side. Amanda watched from the cabin doorway, silent, her doll clutched to her chest. Some days the girl brought water in a tin cup. Other days she simply sat on the step, her presence a small anchor in the world. The hardest part was the smoke channel, the baffled passage that forced the hot exhaust from the cook stove to travel a longer route through the stone before escaping up the flue. Get it wrong and the cabin would fill with smoke, or worse, carbon monoxide on a windless night. Elizabeth built a scale model from kindling and birch bark, tested its draw with a punk of pine resin, watched the smoke curl through the miniature passages. She adjusted the angles, widened a turn, narrowed a throat, until the smoke moved exactly as her father's drawings predicted. Only then did she commit the design to stone. Joseph Wright, the blacksmith, came by in late July. He'd been Robert's closest friend, a man of 60 with hands scarred from forge work, and a mind that understood how metal behaved under stress. He stood at the base of the scaffold, studying the expanded chimney. The the hollow Elizabeth had left in the south face. "You're building a Pismer." Elizabeth paused, trowel in hand. "You know the word?" "My grandfather had one in Telemark. I was 6 when we left." His voice carried the faint surprise of a memory surfacing after decades submerged. "I'd forgotten until I saw this. Most people forgot. Most people came from the coast, where you didn't need it. But my family—" He trailed off, then nodded slowly. "You'll need hinges for the door. I can forge them. I can't pay until after harvest. Robert would have done the same for me. I'll bring them next week." He did. 3 wrought iron hinges, each one hand-shaped, the metal still warm from the anvil. He watched as Elizabeth framed the cupboard's interior, fitting tongue-and-groove pines so tight a blade of grass wouldn't pass between the boards. The cupboard measured 3 feet wide, 6.5 feet long, 4 feet floor to ceiling. The rear wall was the chimney itself. The front wall, the sides, the ceiling, all double-planked with a 2-inch cavity between. Elizabeth spent a week harvesting sphagnum moss from the bog at the valley's edge, spreading it on racks in the loft to dry until it crackled like old paper. When it was ready, she packed it into the cavity by the handful, tamping gently with a dowel, creating an insulation layer that would trap still air the way a bird's down-trapped warmth against skin. Joseph watched her work with the focus of a man solving a puzzle. "I've been trying to build a better heating system for 3 years. Keep failing." "What fails?" "The heat escapes too fast. I can get a room warm, but it won't hold overnight." He gestured to the chimney. "This is different. You're not trying to heat air. You're storing heat in mass." "Exactly. Could I see your father's notes sometime?" Elizabeth considered. Joseph had never mocked her, never called her mad, never joined the whispers that followed her through the valley. "Come back when it's finished. I'll show you." Patricia Anderson appeared at the construction site one morning in August, stepping down from a fine buggy, her skirts clean despite the dust. She did not come to help. She came to observe, her face arranged in an expression of polite bewilderment. "Elizabeth, you're still at this." "I am. The ladies at church are concerned. They wonder if you need assistance, spiritual guidance, perhaps." Elizabeth set down a board, straightened. Patricia was 40, handsome, the kind of woman who moved through rooms as if she owned the air. Her husband, Donald Anderson, farmed 800 acres and kept the largest house in the township. Patricia had position, and she wielded it with the precision of a scalpel. "I appreciate the concern. I'm managing well. Are you?" Patricia's gaze swept the chimney, the scaffold, the numbered stones. "This project seems unusual. Some would say reckless, tearing down a working chimney so close to winter. It will work better when I'm done." "Better how?" "It will keep my niece warm." Patricia's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. She had a son from a previous marriage, a boy of 6 named Timothy who rarely appeared at church. People said the child had weak lungs. People said many things. "I do hope you know what you're doing." Patricia climbed back into the buggy, took the reins. Winter is less forgiving than you might remember. Elizabeth watched her drive away, the dust settling slowly in the heat. She knew what people saw when they looked at her, a widow coming undone, wasting her last resources on madness. Let them think it. She had Amanda to protect, a debt to repay, and a winter to survive. Their opinions weighed less than air. The community crisis came in September. A sickness swept through the cattle, a fever that left them staggering in the fields, their eyes rolling white. Jennifer Davis lost 2 milkers in a single night. Christopher Harris lost 5, his small herd decimated. By the time the sickness burned out, a quarter of the valley's livestock was gone, and with them, the hope of adequate provisions for the months ahead. The families gathered at the church, voices tight with worry. How would they manage without milk, without butter, without the security of animals to barter and breed? Elizabeth had Robert's stores, a root cellar packed with potatoes and turnips, a smokehouse with salt pork, a cache of seed grain Robert had set aside before he died. She offered shares to those who'd lost the most. Jennifer wept with gratitude and sent her husband to help Elizabeth split firewood, 2 cords of oak and ash stacked against the cabin's north wall. Christopher, shamed by his earlier mockery, came to cut hay for the cow Elizabeth still owned, the one animal she could feed through winter. Small alliances formed, quiet and pragmatic. The valley was learning that the widow with the strange chimney was not as helpless as they'd assumed. By October, the sleeping cupboard was finished. Elizabeth hung the door on Joseph's hinges, fitted a wool quilt to the inner face to seal the gaps, installed a small adjustable vent in the upper corner. She built a wooden shelf inside for an oil lamp and a copper pot that would hold water. The floor of the cupboard sat 8 inches above the cabin's main floor, the space beneath packed with planer shavings and dry oak leaves to break the cold rising from below. She made 2 cupboards, a larger one for herself, a smaller one for Amanda, both carved into the expanded chimney mass. The child would sleep warm, whatever came. The first test came on a cold October night, the temperature dropping to 30 degrees by sunset. Elizabeth lit a fire in the cook stove, let it burn for 4 hours, then banked the coals and led Amanda to the smaller cupboard. "You sleep here tonight." Amanda's eyes widened. "Inside? It's warm. Touch the wall." The girl reached out, pressed her palm against the stone. Her face softened, like Mama's hand. Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Yes, the stone remembers warmth. It will keep you safe." She tucked Amanda into the feather tick, closed the door most of the way, left the vent open so the child wouldn't panic in the darkness. Then she climbed into her own cupboard, pulled the door shut, lay back against the stone. The heat soaked through her shift, steady and patient. She read her father's notebook by lamplight, the words blurring as exhaustion crept over her. When she blew out the flame, the darkness was absolute, but the warmth remained. She slept without dreaming. At dawn, she opened the door and stepped into the main room. The thermometer on the wall read 41 degrees. The fire had been out for 9 hours. She opened Amanda's cupboard. The child was still asleep, her cheeks flushed, the wool quilt kicked aside because the space was too warm for covers. Elizabeth touched the stone. Still warm. Her father's calculations had held across an ocean and 30 years. Amanda woke, blinked, smiled. I didn't have bad dreams." Elizabeth's chest loosened for the first time since Robert died. "Good. You won't have bad dreams here." Kenneth Thompson came to visit on a Sunday after church, walking the 2 miles from town with a basket of bread and a jar of honey. He was 68, a man who'd crossed the ocean as a young clerk and built a modest fortune in dry goods. His wife had died a decade past, his children scattered to Minneapolis and beyond. He'd become a fixture of the valley, steady and unassuming, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and extended credit when the harvest failed. Elizabeth led him into the cabin, poured coffee, watched as he examined the sleeping cupboards with the quiet intensity of a man revisiting a ghost. Of course." He climbed into the larger cupboard, sat on the feather tick, ran his hand over the stone. His eyes glistened. "My grandmother had one, in Telemark. I slept there the winter I turned 5, after my mother took ill." His voice was distant, aimed at a past only he could see. "I'd forgotten what it felt like. The way the warmth came from behind, from the stone, like being held." He climbed out slowly, stood with one hand on the doorframe, silent. "This is how we survived," he said finally, in Norwegian so Elizabeth would understand him completely. "This is how we lived through the cold that killed others. And we came here and forgot." He stayed for an hour, asking careful questions about the smoke channel, the moss insulation, the depth of the masonry. When he left, he clasped her hand. "You're not mad, Elizabeth. You're braver than anyone in this valley. And when winter proves it, I'll make sure they know." November brought the first hard frost. Elizabeth began keeping a notebook, a small leather-bound journal where she recorded 3 thermometer readings each morning and evening. Outside, main room, sleeping cupboard. The pattern emerged quickly. When the outside temperature dropped to 15 degrees, the main room with a banked fire held at 52, and the cupboard read 68. When the outside hit 4 degrees, the main room fell to 47. The cupboard held at 66. The stone absorbed heat through the day as she cooked and warmed the cabin, then released it slowly through the night, keeping the small enclosed volume livable even after the fire died to ash. Amanda thrived. She was still shy, still haunted by the mother she'd lost, but she smiled more, spoke more, began learning English from the primer Elizabeth ordered from Kenneth's store. At night, she climbed into her cupboard without fear, and in the morning, she emerged rested. The bad dreams that had plagued her first months in America faded. Elizabeth allowed herself a small measure of hope. Richard Clark returned in late November, ostensibly to check on her progress. He found her splitting kindling beside the woodpile, Amanda playing with her doll near the cabin steps. "You're still here. Where else would I be? I thought the cold might have driven you to sense." There's still time to sell. He glanced at the chimney, now massive and asymmetric, a stone shoulder leaning over the cabin's south wall. That monstrosity won't save you when the real winter comes. We'll see. Mrs. Miller, I'm not a cruel man. But debt doesn't disappear because you're stubborn. 2 years, September 74. $300 or the land is mine. He tipped his hat, a gesture of false courtesy, and rode off. Amanda looked up from her doll. I don't like that man. Neither do I. But he's not wrong about the debt. We can stay, though? Elizabeth knelt, brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. We can stay. I promise. That night, she counted the money she'd saved from Robert's modest estate. $140, carefully hoarded. She'd need another $160 by next September. The sleeping cupboard designs had started attracting quiet inquiries, 3 families who'd heard about the concept and wanted drawings, measurements, advice. If she charged $50 per consultation, if the harvest came in strong, if no catastrophe intervened, the arithmetic was possible. Barely. She opened her father's notebook again, read the inscription on the first page. Big med det som Hugsar, build with what remembers. Stone remembered. She would trust it when wood failed, when people doubted, when winter came to take what it could. Stone had kept her warm as a child. It would keep Amanda warm now. December arrived cold and clear, the sky a hard, pale blue that promised snow. Elizabeth had stockpiled enough firewood for 3 months, enough food for 4. The cow was bedded deep in straw. The chickens moved to the warmest corner of the coop. She tested the cupboards every night, recording temperatures, watching the pattern hold. Everything was ready. All she needed now was for winter to show its hand. On the first Sunday of December, Kenneth Thompson stood at his store counter and told Donald Anderson, in a voice that carried to every customer present, that Elizabeth Miller had built something he hadn't seen since childhood, something sound and true, and that anyone who mocked her in his store would no longer be welcome. Donald left without comment. The story circulated anyway, and the open mockery quieted. But the whispers remained, and Patricia Anderson's tight smile at church suggested the real test was still coming. Elizabeth didn't care. She had Amanda, she had the cupboards, she had the notebooks and the stones, and the memory of her father's steady hands laying courses that lasted generations. Let winter come. She was ready. The blizzard came on December 10th with no warning beyond a stillness in the air that made the horses uneasy in their stalls. Elizabeth was hauling water from the well when the first flakes began, fat and slow, drifting down like ash from a distant fire. By noon the wind had risen, and by nightfall the world had vanished behind a white wall that howled against the cabin walls with a sound like something alive and furious. The storm lasted 3 days. Jennifer Davis burned through her entire week's supply of split firewood by the end of the second night. Her husband, Thomas, went out at dawn on the 3rd day to split green oak in the lee of the woodshed, swinging the axe with numb hands while snow piled against his boots. The green wood smoked more than it burned, filling their cabin with a haze that made their 2-year-old son cough until his face turned red. The temperature inside their main room never climbed above 45 degrees, and the bedroom where the boy slept dropped to 32, cold enough that his breath frosted on the quilts piled over him. The Andersons, in their 8-room house with 2 stoves and a stone fireplace, fared little better. Donald kept fires roaring in both stoves, feeding them split ash until his woodpile shrank by 1/3, but the wind drove cold air through every gap in the chinking faster than the heat could replace it. The upstairs bedrooms became uninhabitable. On the second night, Patricia moved Timothy down to the kitchen, made a pallet for him near the cook stove, wrapped him in every blanket she owned. The boy's cough had worsened through the fall, a rattling sound that came from deep in his chest, and the cold made it worse. She sat beside him through the night, one hand on his forehead, feeling the heat of fever mixing with the chill of the room. Christopher Harris and his wife, Rebecca, spent the worst night in front of their stove with a buffalo robe pulled over both of them, shivering despite the fire. Christopher's ears, exposed when he'd gone out to check the livestock on the first evening, had turned white with frostbite. By morning they were swollen and dark, and Rebecca wept as she packed them with snow, knowing the damage was already done. He would carry the scars the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the night he'd underestimated the cold. Elizabeth and Amanda slept warm. Elizabeth woke twice each night to add wood to the cook stove, keeping a small fire burning to feed heat into the stone mass, but the cupboards required nothing else. The thermometers told the story. Outside, 9 degrees below zero on the worst morning. Main room, 31 degrees. Sleeping cupboards, 67. Amanda never woke, never shivered, never coughed. Elizabeth lay in her cupboard listening to the storm rage and thought about the families down in the valley, about the children sleeping in rooms that could not hold warmth, about the mothers sitting vigil by failing fires. She thought about Emily. The storm broke on the 4th day. Elizabeth walked the half-mile to Kenneth Thompson's store, breaking trail through chest-deep drifts to make sure the old man had survived. She found him alive but stiff with cold, sitting in the back room of his shop wrapped in every coat he owned, his inkwell frozen solid on the desk. She made him coffee on his small heating stove, watched color return to his face, stayed until he could move his fingers again without pain. The cupboard worked? His voice was hoarse from 3 days of cold air. It worked. He studied her over his spectacles, a long look that held something like wonder. May I come see it again? When the road's clear? Any time. Good, because I think I might build one myself. In the back room here. He gestured to the small space where he lived, 8 by 10 feet, heated by a single stove that could barely keep pace with the Wisconsin cold. If an old fool can learn new tricks. It's not new. It's older than either of us, which is why I should have remembered. He poured himself more coffee, his hands still shaking slightly. I'll come Sunday, if you'll teach me. That same afternoon, Patricia Anderson stood in her kitchen staring at the cupboard where she stored preserves and feeling the first crack in her certainty. Timothy was asleep upstairs. Finally, the fever broken but the cough still present, a reminder of how close they'd come. Donald had left to check the cattle, 3 of which had died in the barn despite the relative warmth of the hayloft, their bodies frozen where they stood. Patricia's hands were raw from tending the fires. Her back ached from sleeping on the floor, and the memory of her first husband's death would not leave her alone. James had died 7 years ago in a blizzard not unlike this one. He'd gone out to check the animals and lost his way in the white, found 3 days later frozen against a fence line 30 yards from the barn door. She'd married Donald 6 months later, practical rather than romantic, seeking security for herself and the infant Timothy. Donald was wealthy, stable, a man who could provide, but wealth had not kept Timothy warm these past 3 nights. Wealth had not stopped the cough that sounded so much like the beginning of pleurisy, the same disease that had killed Elizabeth Miller's husband. Patricia had mocked Elizabeth at church. She'd called the sleeping cupboards a coffin, a burial drawer, the delusion of a woman unhinged by grief. She'd done it because Elizabeth threatened something Patricia needed to believe, that money and status offered protection, that a big house with fine furniture was armor against disaster. But Timothy's fever, and the 3 dead cattle, and the memory of James frozen in the snow all argued otherwise. Comfort was not safety. Size was not warmth. She made a decision then, standing in her kitchen with the winter light slanting through windows still hazed with frost. She would go to Elizabeth Miller. She would ask about the cupboards. She would swallow her pride before it choked her. But first, something else required her attention. On the 5th day after the storm, Richard Clark rode into the valley on business unrelated to Elizabeth's debt. He stopped at the Anderson house to discuss a timber contract with Donald, and Patricia, serving coffee in the front room, overheard a conversation that made her blood go cold. The widow Miller still occupying that quarter section up the hill? Donald, pouring cream, nodded. She is. Surprising. I thought the winter would drive her to sense. Clark stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against porcelain. When she fails to repay, I'll take the land at auction. Prime location, that. River access, good timber. I'm prepared to offer you first refusal if you want to expand your holdings. That's generous. Business is business. A woman alone with a child, no income, $300 in debt. The arithmetic doesn't favor her. Clark's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd foreclosed on properties before and would again. Nature will do my work for me. I give her until January. February at the latest. No one survives a Wisconsin winter in a cabin with a ruined chimney. Patricia set down the coffee pot with more force than intended. Both men looked up. The chimney isn't ruined. Clark raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon? Elizabeth Miller's chimney. It's not ruined. She rebuilt it, improved it. Patricia heard herself speaking and couldn't quite believe the words. It works better than ours. Patricia. Donald's tone carried a warning. It's true. Ask anyone who visited. Ask Kenneth Thompson. The woman knows what she's doing. Clark's expression shifted, amusement fading to calculation. I see. Well, loyalty among neighbors is admirable. But knowledge and survival are different matters. We'll see what January brings. After he left, Donald turned to his wife with barely contained frustration. Why did you do that? Because he's counting on her to die. She owes him money. If she can't pay, the land is forfeit. That's law, Patricia. That's how debts work. I know how debts work. I also know how winter works, and I think she might survive it better than we did. Patricia looked at her husband, at the man who owned more land than anyone in the valley but couldn't keep their son warm through a 3-day storm. I'm going to see her tomorrow. To ask about the cupboards. Absolutely not. We are not begging favors from whom? A widow? A madwoman? Someone we mocked at church? Patricia's voice was quiet, but something in it made Donald stop. Timothy nearly died last week, Donald. In this house. Our house. The biggest house in the valley. And Elizabeth Miller's niece slept warm in a cupboard built into a chimney everyone said was insane. So, yes, I'm going to ask. She went the next morning, walking up the hill while Donald was out inspecting fence lines. Elizabeth answered the door with flour on her hands, Amanda visible in the background kneading bread dough on the table. The child looked healthy, her cheeks flushed, her movements easy. Not the pale, fragile thing Patricia had expected. Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Miller. May I speak with you? Elizabeth stepped aside, gestured to the table. Patricia entered, noting the warmth of the room despite the small fire in the stove, noting the massive chimney with its asymmetric bulk, noting the 2 doors built into the south face like entries to secret chambers. I came to warn you about something. Richard Clark is planning to take your land when you can't repay. He's already discussing resale with my husband. Elizabeth poured coffee, her face betraying nothing. I assumed as much. You're not surprised? Mr. Clark is a businessman. Businessmen plan for profit. It's not personal. Even so, you should know. Patricia wrapped her hands around the cup, gathering courage. And I came to ask about the cupboards. What about them? Do they work? Truly? They do. Because Timothy was ill during the storm. The fever broke, but the cough remains. And Patricia's voice caught. I lost my first husband to the cold. I will not lose my son. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment. Amanda stopped kneading, watching the adults with the solemn attention of a child who'd learned to read trouble in silence. Would you like to see inside? Patricia nodded. Elizabeth opened the larger cupboard, stepped back. Patricia approached cautiously, peered into the space, saw the feather tick, the shelf with its lamp, the quilted door, the stone wall at the back. She reached in, touched the masonry. Still warm, hours after the morning fire had burned down to coals. How? The stone absorbs heat through the day, releases it slowly at night. The insulation keeps it from escaping. The small space means body heat alone can maintain livable temperature. Elizabeth's tone was matter-of-fact, instructional. It won't work with your existing chimney without significant modification, but it could be built as a wooden enclosure against the chimney's interior face. Less thermal mass, but still effective. Could you? Would you help us design one? For Timothy? Yes. The answer came without hesitation, without condition, and Patricia felt something inside her shift, a weight she'd carried since James died suddenly lighter. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Your husband may object. Donald will accept it. When he sees Timothy stop coughing, Patricia stood, set down the cup. I'm sorry. For what I said at church. For calling this madness. You were afraid. Fear makes people cruel. I understand. You're kinder than I deserve. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. I remember what it's like to be afraid for a child. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Patricia left with measurements written on a slip of paper and instructions to have her carpenter contact Elizabeth for detailed plans. Walking back down the hill, she passed Christopher Harris heading up, his ears still bandaged, his face set with the determined shame of a man about to apologize for being wrong. January came in cold and stayed cold, the temperature dropping day by day as a vast high-pressure system settled over the upper Midwest and refused to move. On January 8th, the thermometer at Kenneth Thompson's store read 14 below zero at sunrise. The old man recorded it in his ledger, the first entry of what would become a historic weather record. On January 9th, the temperature was 26 below. On January 10th, 38 below. The air took on a crystalline quality, each breath visible as a cloud that hung in the stillness. And the silence was profound, the kind of quiet that made people whisper inside their own homes. Elizabeth noted the readings in her notebook with mechanical precision. Outside, -42. Main room, 19 degrees above zero. Sleeping cupboards, 69. She fed the cook stove twice during the night, quick trips from cupboard to stove and back, the whole operation taking less than 3 minutes. Amanda slept through it, the child's breathing slow and even in the smaller cupboard. The copper pot of water in Elizabeth's cupboard never developed the slightest skin of ice. Down in the valley, the crisis deepened. Jennifer Davis's 2-year-old son developed a fever on the 11th, his small body shaking with chills despite the blankets piled over him. The boy had spent the night on a pallet near the stove, but the fire had burned low at 3 in the morning while Thomas slept, and for 2 hours the child had breathed air that hovered near 20 degrees. By dawn, his temperature was 103, and a cough had started that sounded like gravel shifting in his chest. Jennifer sat with him through the day, spooning willow bark tea between his lips, bathing his face with cool cloths, praying in a voice that grew hoarse with repetition. Christopher Harris woke at 2 in the morning to find Rebecca shivering uncontrollably, despite 3 quilts and a buffalo robe. Their bedroom, partitioned from the main cabin by a single thin wall, had dropped below freezing. He carried his wife to the main room, built up the fire until the stove glowed red, held her against his chest until the shaking stopped. His ears, still healing from the December frostbite, ached with a pain that made him nauseated, but he ignored it. Rebecca's welfare mattered more. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode to his father's farm 1.5 miles down the road, and when he arrived, his ears were so badly frostbitten that the cartilage would necrotize and slough away over the following weeks, leaving permanent disfigurement. The Andersons fought their own battle. Despite 2 stoves and Donald's constant attention, the upstairs bedrooms dropped to levels that made occupation impossible. On the night of January 12th, when the outside temperature fell to 43 below zero, the family moved mattresses down to the kitchen floor and slept in a row like refugees, the dog curled at their feet for whatever warmth his body provided. Timothy's cough had worsened through the week, a wet rattling sound that woke Patricia from fitful sleep. She lay on the hard floor, her cheek pressed against a folded coat serving as pillow, and thought about the cupboard Elizabeth had shown her, about the stone that remembered warmth, about the child who slept soundly while her own son struggled to breathe. At 3 in the morning on January 13th, the worst morning of the entire cold spell, Timothy coughed up blood. Not much, just a pink stain on the handkerchief Patricia held to his mouth, but enough to trigger a panic that bypassed all reason. She shook Donald awake with hands that trembled. "We have to take him to Elizabeth." Donald, groggy and confused, stared at her. "What?" "She can save him. The cupboard. It's warm. He needs warmth." Patricia was already wrapping Timothy in blankets, lifting him, the boy's weight slight in her arms. "Please, Donald. Now. It's 45 below. We'll all die out there. He'll die here." Patricia's voice cracked. I watched James freeze. I will not watch my son drown in his own lungs because we were too proud to ask for help. The raw desperation in her tone cut through Donald's hesitation. He dressed quickly, layered wool over wool, wrapped his face with a scarf, pulled on the heaviest mittens he owned. Patricia bundled Timothy until only his eyes showed, the child too weak to protest. They went out into the cold. The half-mile to Elizabeth's cabin took 20 minutes, Donald breaking trail through snow that had drifted waist-deep in places, Patricia following with Timothy clutched to her chest. The cold was absolute, a thing beyond weather, beyond temperature, an entity that sought every exposed inch of skin and punished it. Donald's mustache froze solid. Patricia's eyelashes crusted with ice. Timothy made small whimpering sounds that barely carried over the crunch of boots in snow. Elizabeth answered the door on the third knock, lamp in hand, her face sharp with concern. She took in the scene instantly. The desperate parents, the sick child, the cold that poured through the open door like water. Inside. Quickly. Donald stumbled in, Patricia behind him. Elizabeth closed the door, set the lamp on the table, moved with swift efficiency to the larger sleeping cupboard. She opened it, pulled out the feather tick, spread it on the main room floor. "Put him here while I prepare." Patricia laid Timothy down. The boy's breathing was shallow, labored. Elizabeth stoked the cook stove, added wood, adjusted the damper. Then she went to Amanda's cupboard, opened it gently. Amanda, wake up, sweetness. The child stirred, blinked. Dee, you're moving to my cupboard tonight. A sick boy needs your warm bed. Amanda climbed out without complaint, already accustomed to trusting her aunt's decisions. Elizabeth guided her to the larger cupboard, tucked her in, then returned to Timothy. She lifted the boy, still wrapped in his blankets, and carried him to the smaller cupboard. The interior was warm from Amanda's body heat, the stone radiating stored warmth from the day's fire. She laid Timothy on the mattress, arranged the quilts over him, left the door open a hand's width so he wouldn't panic in the enclosed space. He stays until the fever breaks, however long that takes. Patricia's eyes filled. Thank you. Sit by the stove, both of you. Warm yourselves. They sat. Elizabeth made coffee, strong and bitter, and they drank it without speaking. Outside, the thermometer Donald could see through the window read 45 below zero. Inside the cupboard, Timothy lay in 70-degree warmth, his body slowly releasing the tension that had gripped his chest for days. 4 hours passed. Donald dozed in the chair, exhausted from the walk and the week of insufficient sleep. Patricia stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the cupboard door, watching for any sign of distress. Elizabeth moved quietly around the cabin, checking the stove, adding wood, maintaining the system that kept the stone mass warm and the cupboards livable. At one point, she opened Amanda's door slightly, checked the child. Amanda was asleep again, her breathing easy, unbothered by the change in location. As dawn approached, Timothy's breathing changed. The rattle smoothed, the gasping eased, the rhythm steadied into something closer to normal sleep. Patricia noticed first, her shoulders sagging with relief so profound it bordered on pain. Elizabeth opened the cupboard door wider, checked the boy's forehead. The fever had broken. Sweat dampened his hair, and his color had shifted from the grayish pallor of illness to something healthier. He'll need fluids when he wakes. Broth if you have it. And rest. But he's through the worst. Patricia stood, crossed to the cupboard, looked down at her son sleeping peacefully in the space that had been mocked as a coffin. How can I repay you? You can't, and you don't need to. We mocked you, Donald and I both. At church, in the store, everywhere. Yes, the simple acknowledgement, free of rancor, was somehow harder to bear than anger would have been. Patricia sank into a chair, her face in her hands. I don't understand how you can forgive that, because I know what you were afraid of, and because Timothy is a child. He doesn't deserve to suffer for his parents' mistakes. Elizabeth poured more coffee, set the cup in front of Patricia. Also, I'm not interested in forgiveness. I'm interested in keeping children alive. That's all. Donald woke, saw Timothy sleeping peacefully, saw his wife's face, understood what had happened. He stood, approached Elizabeth, extended his hand. Whatever you need. From this day forward, you ask, I provide. I'll need detailed measurements of your chimney. Timothy should have his own cupboard at home. Consider it done. They stayed until mid-morning, when the temperature had climbed to a almost tolerable 19 below. Timothy woke hungry and alert, the cough reduced to occasional throat clearing. Patricia wrapped him again, and the family made their way back down the hill, moving slowly, the child riding on Donald's shoulders. Elizabeth watched them go, then turned to find Amanda standing beside her, the girl's hand slipping into hers. That boy was very sick. He was. Will he be okay now? I think so. Because of the cupboard? Yes. Amanda nodded, processing this. Mama would have liked your cupboards. Elizabeth's throat tightened. She squeezed the small hand. I wish she could have had one. That same week, while Timothy Anderson recovered in a hastily constructed sleeping cupboard in the Anderson kitchen, Joseph Wright sat in his workshop staring at the smoking ruin of his latest heating system. He'd been trying for 3 years to design something better than the standard stove, something that would hold heat longer, burn less fuel, keep a room warm through a Wisconsin night. He'd failed 11 times, each iteration an improvement over the last but still fundamentally inadequate. This 12th attempt had been his most ambitious. A combination of cast iron stove and masonry heat sink, meant to absorb warmth during burning and radiate it for hours afterward. It had filled his shop with smoke within an hour of lighting, the draft all wrong, the baffles incorrectly sized, the whole thing a testament to the gap between theory and practice. Joseph sat on his work stool, 60 years old and no closer to success than he'd been when he started, and wondered why he kept trying. The answer walked through his door late that afternoon. Elizabeth Miller, carrying her father's notebook, Amanda at her side. I heard you had trouble with your heating design. Joseph gestured to the smoking mess in the corner. I can't get the draft right. Thought I understood the principles. Clearly don't. May I see your drawings? He unrolled them on the workbench, watched her study the sketches with the focused attention of someone who read mechanical drawings like others read novels. After a moment, she shook her head. You're trying to force it. Thinking if you make it big enough, powerful enough, it will work by sheer force. What's wrong with that? Stone doesn't respond to force. It responds to patience. She opened her father's notebook, pointed to a diagram. Look, the smoke channel isn't about power, it's about path. The longer the hot exhaust travels through the mass, the more heat it deposits. But if the path is too narrow, it chokes. Too wide, it rushes through without transferring. The proportions have to be exact. Joseph leaned closer, seeing the annotations in Norwegian, the careful measurements, the ratios that governed success. Your father knew all this? His father knew it. And his father before him. 600 years of trial and error, distilled into these pages. Elizabeth traced a line with her finger. You're trying to invent what already exists. Why not learn it instead? Because I'm too proud. The admission came easier than he'd expected. Thought I could do better than the old ways. The old ways work. Modern improvements can come after you master the foundation. They spent the next 2 hours going through the notebook, Elizabeth translating the Nynorsk into English, explaining the logic behind each measurement, each angle, each material choice. Joseph took notes in a cramped hand, occasionally asking questions that revealed the depth of his misunderstanding. By the time they finished, his respect for the anonymous Norwegian stonemasons who'd developed these techniques had deepened into something close to awe. Would you be willing to partner on a design? Your traditional knowledge, my modern materials? Elizabeth considered. What would we build? A modular system. Easier to install than a full Pismer, more effective than a standard stove. Something that could be added to existing homes without tearing down chimneys. His eyes brightened with the first excitement he'd felt in months. We could file for a patent, split the royalties. Royalties would help with Mr. Clark's debt. Then we have an agreement? We do. They shook hands, Amanda watching with solemn approval. On the way home, the child looked up at her aunt with a question that had been forming for weeks. Dee, why do you help people who were mean to you? Elizabeth thought about Patricia's desperation, about Joseph's failures, about the valley full of families struggling through a winter that cared nothing for pride or status or old grievances, because mean people still freeze. And I remember what freezing feels like. The cold broke on January 17th, the sky clouding over from the southwest, a wind rising that carried moisture and relative warmth from the Mississippi Valley. By noon, the thermometer had climbed to 19 below, which felt to everyone who emerged from their cabins like the first breath of spring. The valley took stock. 3 cattle lost at the Anderson farm. 22 pounds of butter frozen and ruined in Kenneth Thompson's cellar. Christopher Harris's ears permanently scarred. Jennifer Davis's son alive but weakened, his lungs damaged in ways that would affect him for years. And Elizabeth Miller, untouched, her cupboards having performed exactly as the 600-year-old design promised they would. The shift in attitude was not immediate, not universal, but it was real. The families who'd mocked the chimney woman in autumn found themselves remembering that she'd asked no one for help during the worst weather in living memory, that she'd lost no livestock, that she'd walked down the hill with fresh eggs for Kenneth Thompson while others huddled in their beds. More than that, she'd saved Timothy Anderson, opening her door at 3 a.m. without hesitation, asking nothing in return. Within 3 weeks of the cold snap, 4 families had begun construction on sleeping cupboards. Jennifer Davis hired a carpenter and specified exact measurements based on plans Elizabeth provided free of charge. Christopher Harris built his own, working despite his damaged ears, driven by a shame he couldn't articulate but could only expiate through labor. Kenneth Thompson converted the back room of his store, installing a small cupboard against the brick chimney that served his heating stove. Even the Andersons, despite their wealth and status, built 2 cupboards, one for Timothy, one for the master bedroom. The technique spread beyond Pine Valley. A correspondent for the Street Croix Valley Standard wrote a feature story after his sister built a cupboard near Stillwater and reported its performance through a cold snap. The Minneapolis Tribune reprinted the article with additional technical details. By spring, Inquiries were arriving at Kenneth Thompson's store, addressed to the widow Miller, Pine Valley, asking for plans, measurements, consultation. Elizabeth responded to each one, charging $50 for a detailed consultation with drawings. The money accumulated slowly but steadily in the tin box where she kept her accounts. In late March, she counted the total, $240. Still 60 short of what she owed Richard Clark, but closer than she'd dared hope 6 months earlier. The Miller-Wright heating system patent application, filed in February, would take months to process, but Joseph was confident it would succeed, and royalties from manufacturing licenses could cover the gap. For the first time since Robert's death, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe she might keep the land. Spring came late and cold, but it came. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing a landscape scoured by winter, fences down, fields littered with branches torn from trees by ice storms. Elizabeth and Amanda worked the garden as soon as the ground thawed, planting potatoes and turnips and the heritage seeds Robert had saved from Norway. The cow calved in April, a healthy heifer that meant milk through the summer and a second animal to sell or breed. The chickens, all of which had survived in their protected coop, began laying again. Richard Clark appeared on a warm day in May, riding up the hill with the casual assurance of a man who'd foreclosed on enough properties to know how these visits typically ended. He found Elizabeth in the garden, Amanda beside her pulling early weeds, both of them smudged with dirt and unbothered by his arrival. "Mrs. Miller, you're still here. I am. Surprising. Most widows would have taken the winter as a sign. A sign of what? That some endeavors are beyond a woman's capacity." He dismounted, looped the reins over a fence post. "I'm prepared to renew my offer, $250 for the land. More than generous, given its current state." Elizabeth stood, wiped her hands on her apron. "The debt comes due in September. You'll have your money then. $300? From what source?" "Consultations. Patent royalties. The harvest. Consultations on what?" "Heating systems. There's been considerable interest." Clark's expression shifted, doubt creeping in at the edges. "You're telling me people are paying you for advice on that contraption in your chimney?" "They are." "How much have you earned?" "Enough." Elizabeth met his eyes without flinching. "You'll have your $300 in September, Mr. Clark. And then we're done." He studied her, this woman who'd been written off as mad, who'd endured mockery and isolation and a winter that killed cattle, and who stood here now with dirt under her nails, an absolute conviction in her voice. Something in his certainty wavered. "We'll see what autumn brings." "Yes, we will." He rode away without further comment. Amanda looked up from the weeds, her face serious beyond her years. "Will we have the money?" "We will." "How do you know?" "Because I built something that works. And people pay for things that work." Elizabeth returned to the garden, her hands moving through the soil with the same patient precision she'd used to lay stones, to pack moss, to create warmth from memory and mathematics. "Also, I promised you we'd stay. I keep my promises." By summer, 7 families in Pine Valley had sleeping cupboards. By harvest, the number had reached 12, and inquiries were coming from as far as the Dakota Territory. The Norwegian language press in Decorah and Minneapolis published how-to articles with measured drawings, crediting the innovation to traditional piecemeal design adapted for American construction. Elizabeth's name appeared in some versions, absent in others, but the royalty checks from the Miller-Wright patent began arriving in August, modest but consistent. On September 1st, 1874, Elizabeth Miller walked into Richard Clark's office above his lumber mill and counted out $300 in cash on his desk. He verified the amount, wrote out a receipt, stamped the original promissory note paid in full, and handed both documents across the desk. "I underestimated you." "You did. For what it's worth, I'm glad I was wrong. The valley needs people who remember how to survive." He stood, extended his hand. "If you ever need lumber at cost, you have my word on it." She shook his hand, surprised by the sincerity. "I'll remember that." Walking home with the stamped note in her pocket and Amanda skipping beside her, Elizabeth felt a loosening in her chest that she hadn't realized was there, a knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for 2 years, finally releasing its grip. The land was hers. The debt was cleared. Amanda was safe, healthy, learning English and Norwegian and the mathematics of thermal mass. The cupboards had proven themselves through the worst winter in living memory. Stone had remembered. She had survived. That night, she wrote in her notebook for the last time, a final entry beneath columns of temperature readings. The 1st of September 1874. Debt paid. Land secure. Amanda safe. Stone kept its promise. So did I. The years folded into each other like pages in a book whose spine had been cracked from reading too many times. Elizabeth turned 44, then 45, the seasons marking time with planting and harvest, with snow and thaw, with the steady accumulation of small victories that no one recorded but everyone felt. Amanda grew taller, her English fluent now, her Norwegian still strong enough to read the old letters from Telemark that Elizabeth kept in a wooden box under the bed. The child asked questions constantly, insatiable questions about why stone held heat and wood did not, about why the smoke channel had to curve just so, about the mathematics of thermal transfer and the physics of still air. Elizabeth answered what she could, and admitted freely when she reached the limits of her knowledge. Patricia Anderson became an unexpected fixture in Elizabeth's life, appearing at the cabin once a week with eggs or bread or simply conversation, the initial debt of gratitude, slowly transforming into something neither woman named, but both recognized as friendship. They sat at the rough pine table drinking coffee while Amanda and Timothy played outside, two women who'd started as adversaries and found common ground in the universal terror of watching children suffer. Patricia never apologized again for the mockery, and Elizabeth never brought it up. The past stayed where it belonged. One afternoon in late summer of 1874, Patricia arrived with her hands wrapped around a problem she couldn't solve alone. She stood in the cabin doorway, her composure cracked just enough to show the fear beneath. "I need to ask you something. About fear." Elizabeth poured coffee without comment, waited. "When Emily died, how did you keep going? How did you wake up every morning knowing you'd failed to protect her?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth set down the pot, chose her words with care. "I didn't fail to protect her. I failed to know enough. Those are different things." "Are they?" "Yes. Failure of knowledge can be corrected. Failure of will cannot." Elizabeth wrapped her hands around her own cup, the warmth seeping into her palms. "I woke up every morning because Amanda needed me to. Because the cows needed milking and the chickens needed feeding, and because lying in bed cursing God doesn't bring anyone back. You do the next thing, and then the next. And eventually you realize you're still alive and maybe there's a reason for that." Patricia's eyes were wet. "I dream about James freezing. Even now, 7 years later, I see him lost in the snow, calling for help, and I can't reach him. You'll always see it. The images don't leave. But they change. They become part of the foundation instead of the whole structure." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You saved Timothy. You swallowed your pride and asked for help when it mattered. James would have been proud of that. Would he? I think so. Because Timothy is alive and healthy and laughing outside with Amanda right now. That's not failure, Patricia. That's victory." Patricia wiped her eyes, nodded slowly. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes between people who've stopped performing for each other. When Patricia finally left, she paused at the door. "Thank you. For this. For all of it. For coffee? For being honest when everyone else offers platitudes." Patricia managed a small smile. "And for the coffee." Michael Martinez arrived in Pine Valley in the spring of 1875, a Swedish carpenter hired to build the new church after the old one had burned in a winter fire that started from an overheated stove. He was 45, weathered from years of outdoor work, with calloused hands and a quiet competence that showed in everything he touched. His wife had died 3 years earlier in Minnesota, pneumonia taking her in a week, and he'd been moving from town to town ever since, building churches and schools and barns, never staying long enough to put down roots. He heard about Elizabeth Miller's sleeping cupboards from Kenneth Thompson, who'd become an unofficial ambassador for the design, evangelizing to anyone who'd listen about how the old Norwegian woman on the hill had saved the valley from freezing. Michael asked to see the original installation, more from professional curiosity than personal interest, and Kenneth arranged the introduction. Elizabeth showed him the cupboards with the same patient explanation she'd given dozens of times, expecting another consultation request, another set of measurements to draft. Instead, Michael climbed into the larger cupboard, sat for a long moment running his hand over the stone, then climbed out with an expression Elizabeth couldn't quite read. "My grandmother had one of these. In Dalarna." I slept there the winter I turned 8, when my father was away working timber. His voice carried the same distant quality Kenneth's had shown, the sound of memory surfacing from deep water. I'd forgotten what it felt like. The way the warmth came from behind instead of from the air. Most people forget. But you didn't. I had reasons not to. He studied her with interest that felt different from the usual curiosity, less clinical, more personal. Would you let me buy you dinner at the hotel? I'd like to hear those reasons, if you're willing to share them. Elizabeth hesitated. She hadn't thought of herself as a woman who might interest a man in over 3 years, hadn't considered the possibility that her life might include anything beyond survival and Amanda's care. But Michael's eyes held something she recognized, the loneliness of competence, the isolation that came from being the person everyone relied on but no one truly knew. I'd like that. They went to the hotel the following Saturday, Amanda staying with Patricia for the evening, and over pot roast and boiled potatoes Michael told her about his wife, Anna, about how she'd made him laugh even when money was scarce and work was hard, about how her death had left him unmoored in a way he still hadn't learned to navigate. Elizabeth told him about Robert, about Emily, about the winter that killed her daughter and the notebook that saved her niece. They talked until the dining room emptied, and the proprietor began pointedly stacking chairs. The courtship proceeded slowly, cautiously. Two people who'd both learned that happiness was fragile and grief could arrive without warning. Michael built the church through the summer, and most evenings he'd stop by Elizabeth's cabin on his way back to the boarding house, ostensibly to discuss joinery techniques or wood selection, but really just to sit at the table and talk while Amanda did her lessons. He taught the girl basic carpentry, showing her how to read grain and choose chisels, and measure twice because wood forgave nothing. Amanda took to it with the same intensity she brought to everything, and within weeks, she could cut a mortise and tenon joint that held square. Elizabeth watched them together, the tall, quiet carpenter and the serious child, and felt something she'd thought died with Robert, the possibility of family. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but an expansion of what remained. They married in October 1875, a small ceremony at the new church Michael had built, with Patricia and Donald standing witness, and Amanda holding a bouquet of fall asters. Kenneth Thompson wept openly, which made Amanda giggle, which made everyone else smile despite the solemnity. The wedding breakfast at the Andersons' house marked a shift no one commented on, but everyone noticed. The widow who'd been mocked 3 years earlier was now fully integrated into the valley's fabric, her knowledge respected, her presence valued, her happiness celebrated. Michael moved into the cabin and immediately began improving it, adding a proper bedroom, enlarging the windows, building Amanda a sleeping loft with her own cupboard installed against the chimney's north face. He worked with the precision Elizabeth appreciated, never rushing, never cutting corners, creating joints that would outlast the people who commissioned them. At night they lay in their new bedroom, the warmth from the chimney mast seeping through the wall, and talked about the future in a way Elizabeth hadn't dared to do since burying her husband under the oak tree. "I'd like to build you a workshop," Michael said one evening, his hand finding hers under the quilts. "A proper one, with good light and a drafting table. You could consult more easily, design more variations. I'm not an engineer. You're better than most engineers I've met. You understand why things work, not just how to make them work." He squeezed her hand gently. "And Amanda watches everything you do. If she sees you working seriously, taking yourself seriously, she'll believe she can do the same." The workshop went up in the spring of 1876, a small building beside the cabin with tall windows facing north and a stove of Michael's design that incorporated thermal mass principles Elizabeth had taught him. She moved her drafting work there, and within months had more consultation requests than she could handle, people writing from as far as the Dakota Territory and Montana, asking for plans, measurements, modifications for different climates, and building types. The Miller-Wright patent had been approved, and Joseph Wright's manufacturing connections meant modular heating systems were being installed in schools and churches across the Midwest. The royalties provided steady income, enough that Elizabeth could hire help for the heavy farm work and focus on what she did best, remembering what others had forgotten and teaching them how to apply it. Amanda turned 10 in 1876, already taller than most girls her age, her hands rough from garden work and carpentry, her mind sharp enough to correct Elizabeth's arithmetic when the numbers went astray. The child had started asking questions that pushed beyond Elizabeth's knowledge, not just how thermal mass worked, but why, not just what materials conducted heat, but what made them do it at the molecular level. Elizabeth recognized the hunger, and knew she couldn't feed it alone. One evening at dinner, Elizabeth set down her fork and made a decision that felt like opening a door she couldn't close again. "Amanda, how would you feel about going to school? Real school? In a city?" The girl's eyes widened. "Where?" "Chicago, maybe. There are academies there, places that teach science and mathematics properly, better than I can. But I want to learn from you. You have learned from me. Everything I know, you know. But there's more to know than I can teach." Elizabeth reached across the table, took the child's hand. "I promised your mother I'd give you every chance. This is a chance." Amanda looked at Michael, who nodded encouragement, then back at Elizabeth. "Would I come home? Every summer, every Christmas. This is your home, Amanda. Always." The arrangements took a year to finalize. Elizabeth wrote to a women's technical institute in Chicago that admitted students as young as 12, enclosed letters of recommendation from Joseph Wright and the county surveyor who'd reviewed the Miller-Wright patent applications, and waited. The acceptance letter arrived in the spring of 1877, along with a scholarship offer that covered tuition but not board. Elizabeth paid the difference from the patent royalties without hesitation. Amanda left in September, a small figure in a new traveling dress, carrying a carpet bag and Robert Williams's old leather notebook, which Elizabeth had given her the night before. The parting at the train station in the river settlement was brief and painful, both of them trying not to cry, both failing. "Learn everything," Elizabeth managed, her voice thick. "I will. And write. Every week. I promise." The train pulled away, and Elizabeth stood on the platform long after it vanished from sight, feeling the particular emptiness that comes from doing the right thing at great personal cost. Michael stood beside her, his presence solid, his hand on her shoulder a reminder that she wasn't alone even when it felt that way. "She'll be brilliant." "I know. That's what scares me." Amanda's letters arrived like clockwork, every Sunday without fail, pages filled with descriptions of classes in thermodynamics and structural engineering, with questions about the sleeping cupboards that showed she was thinking about them in new ways, with occasional confessions of homesickness that broke Elizabeth's heart from 400 miles away. The girl thrived academically, finishing 2 years of coursework in 18 months, impressing instructors with her intuitive grasp of heat transfer and her ability to explain complex principles in simple terms. She struggled socially, the only girl in most of her classes, the only student who'd grown up on a farm rather than in a city, but she persisted with the same stubborn determination Elizabeth recognized from her own reflection. Kenneth Thompson died in the winter of 1879, peacefully in his sleep, in the small cupboard he'd built in the back room of his store. He was 75, had seen the valley grow from raw wilderness to settled farmland, had extended credit to half the families in the township at one point or another, and had never married or fathered children but had somehow become everyone's favorite uncle. His funeral drew 300 people. Elizabeth spoke briefly, her voice steady until she reached the line about how Kenneth had believed when others mocked, at which point she had to pause and gather herself. He'd left his store to his nephew, but he'd left Elizabeth $500 in his will, along with a note written in Norwegian. "For Amanda's education, make sure she finishes." She used every penny for that purpose. Patricia's transformation over the years was subtle, but complete. The woman who'd mocked Elizabeth at church in 1872 became the woman who organized a fundraiser in 1880 when the valley's one-room school needed a new roof, who convinced her husband to donate lumber for Kenneth's nephew to expand the store, who quietly paid the doctor's bills for families who couldn't afford them. She and Elizabeth met for coffee weekly, a tradition that continued unbroken for years, and their conversations ranged from the trivial to the profound with equal comfort. One afternoon in 1883, Patricia arrived at the workshop with a letter in her hand and tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth knew immediately what it meant. Timothy, now 17 and apprentice to a lawyer in Minneapolis, had been accepted to the state university. The boy who'd nearly died at 6 years old would become the first in his family to attend college. "This is because of you." Elizabeth shook her head. "This is because of Timothy. And because you were brave enough to ask for help when it mattered." "I wasn't brave. I was desperate." Desperation that saves a life becomes bravery in retrospect. Elizabeth poured tea, a ritual they'd developed over years of these conversations. "Also, you've spent the last decade being kind to people who have nothing to offer you in return. That's not desperation. That's character." Patricia wiped her eyes, managed a smile. When did you become so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to have made all the mistakes already. They laughed, and the moment passed. But something in Patricia's expression suggested she'd been carrying this conversation in her head for a long time and had finally found the courage to voice it. I want you to know. If something happens to me, Donald has instructions. Everything I have goes to Timothy, but there's a fund set aside for Amanda's education, whatever she needs. Elizabeth's throat tightened. Patricia, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Because my son is alive and going to university, and your niece is the reason I learned to ask for help instead of drowning in pride. Patricia set down her cup, met Elizabeth's eyes, and because you've become the sister I never had. So let me do this, please. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Some gifts were too large for words. Amanda returned from Chicago in the summer of 1885, 20 years old, and freshly graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. She stepped off the train in the river settlement, transformed, taller, more confident, carrying herself with the assured competence of someone who'd proven themselves in rooms full of skeptics and emerged victorious. But when she saw Elizabeth and Michael waiting on the platform, her professional composure cracked, and she ran to them like the child who'd left 8 years earlier. That evening at the cabin, surrounded by Michael's carpentry projects and Elizabeth's drafting plans and the smell of bread baking, Amanda spread her thesis across the kitchen table, a comprehensive analysis of traditional thermal mass heating systems, with mathematical models that quantified what Elizabeth's father had understood intuitively. The girl had tested different stone types, calculated specific heat capacities, measured thermal conductivity, and produced a document that was equal parts engineering paper and love letter to the old ways. I want to build on what you've done, Amanda said, her voice carrying the earnestness that had never left her despite the years of polish. Not replace it, build on it. Make it accessible to people who don't have Norwegian grandfathers and leather notebooks. What do you have in mind? Standardized designs, pre-cut kits that any carpenter could assemble, training programs for builders. Amanda's hands moved as she talked, sketching invisible structures in the air. And I want to work with Joseph Wright. Improve the Miller-Wright system. Make it more efficient, more affordable. There are people freezing in cities, Aunt Beth. In tenements with no heat, except coal stoves that kill them with fumes. We could change that. Elizabeth looked at her niece, this brilliant young woman who'd grown from a terrified 4-year-old into an engineer capable of reshaping the world, and felt pride so intense it bordered on pain. Then we'll change it. Together. They spent the next 5 years doing exactly that. Amanda and Joseph Wright formed a partnership, developing a series of modular heating systems that incorporated thermal mass principles with modern manufacturing techniques. The designs were elegant, efficient, and above all, affordable. By 1890, Miller-Wright-Martinez systems were being installed in schools from Wisconsin to Washington Territory, in churches across the Great Plains, in municipal buildings where taxpayers demanded value for money. The royalties made Amanda financially independent by the time she turned 25. She married in 1892, a fellow engineer named Thomas Fletcher who'd worked on some of the same projects and shared her passion for making warmth accessible. They built a house in the river settlement with sleeping cupboards for the 3 children who arrived in quick succession, and Amanda commuted to the old cabin twice a week to work with Elizabeth on new designs. The tradition of coffee and drafting became a fixed point in both their lives, an anchor against the accelerating pace of everything else. Elizabeth turned 60 in 1893, her hands increasingly stiff with arthritis, her eyesight requiring spectacles for fine work, her body carrying the accumulated weight of 6 decades of Wisconsin winters. Michael, now 63, had slowed his carpentry but still took pleasure in small projects, making toys for Amanda's children, carving wooden birds that sat on the workshop windowsills. They'd had 20 years together. Good years. 2 years that had softened the sharp edges of earlier grief, without erasing it entirely. Patricia Anderson died in the spring of 1895, her heart giving out suddenly while she tended her garden. The funeral was large, reflecting the respect she'd earned through decades of quiet generosity, and Elizabeth spoke at her friend's graveside about transformation and courage and the possibility of becoming better than you'd been. Later, going through Patricia's papers, Donald found a letter addressed to Elizabeth, sealed and dated 3 months earlier. Elizabeth read it alone in the workshop, tears streaming down her face as Patricia's voice came through the careful script. Apologies for cruelties long forgiven, gratitude for mercies long given, a confession that Timothy's survival had taught her the difference between comfort and safety, between pride and strength. The letter ended with a line that would stay with Elizabeth the rest of her life. You showed me that surrendering certainty wasn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing that saves us. Michael died in 1898, his heart stopping while he sat in his favorite chair reading the newspaper, the transition from life to death so gentle he might have simply fallen asleep. Elizabeth found him at dusk, the paper still in his lap, his reading glasses slipped down his nose. She sat beside him for a long time before calling anyone, her hand on his, grateful for the peaceful end, devastated by the loss. She stayed in the cabin after he died, Amanda offering repeatedly to move her to town, to the larger house with modern conveniences and closer proximity to doctors. Elizabeth refused. The cabin was where she'd saved Amanda, where she'd built the first cupboards, where she'd proven everyone wrong and kept everyone alive. She would not leave it for the dubious comforts of city life. The new century arrived, and Elizabeth marked it by updating her will, leaving the cabin and land to Amanda with specific instructions. The sleeping cupboards were to be preserved, the workshop maintained, the techniques documented for future generations. She'd received letters from all over the country by then, testimonials from people who'd built cupboards based on her plans, who'd survived winters that would have killed them otherwise, whose children slept warm because Elizabeth Miller had remembered what her father taught her. A young journalist from the Decorah Posten came to interview her in the spring of 1902, a earnest Norwegian immigrant who wanted to write about the Pismer tradition for readers who'd forgotten their heritage. Elizabeth, now 73, sat with him at the kitchen table and explained the history she'd learned from her father, the science Amanda had quantified, the practical applications that had spread across a continent. Why do you think people forgot? The journalist's pencil moved across his notepad in quick strokes. Because they came from places where they didn't need it. Coastal districts, where peat burned and houses stayed small. Elizabeth's voice was still strong, her mind still sharp despite her body's increasing frailty. And because America promised abundance, wood everywhere, land everywhere, the idea that you could heat as much space as you wanted. But abundance doesn't protect against cold. Knowledge protects against cold. And you brought that knowledge here. I brought a notebook and a memory. That's all. She gestured to her father's book, now worn and fragile, still kept on the shelf above the stove. 600 years of Norwegian stonemasons learning how to keep children alive through telemark winters. I just applied their work to Wisconsin. Some would call that innovation. Some would be wrong. Innovation implies creating something new. I remembered something old. There's a difference. The journalist published his article in June, and it was reprinted in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, prompting another wave of letters and consultation requests that Elizabeth, increasingly tired, turned over to Amanda to handle. The younger woman had surpassed her aunt years ago, understanding not just what worked but why, able to optimize designs for different climates and building types in ways Elizabeth's empirical approach couldn't match. The student had become the master, exactly as it should be. Elizabeth spent the winter of 1903 mostly in the cabin, her arthritis making the walk to the workshop difficult, her energy limited to a few good hours each day. Amanda visited constantly, bringing the grandchildren, filling the space with noise and life and the sweet chaos of family. The oldest grandchild, a girl named Emily after the aunt she'd never met, showed the same mechanical aptitude that ran through the women of this family like an underground river, asking questions about heat transfer and insulation that made Elizabeth smile, even as fatigue pulled at her bones. The cold came early in 1904, a January as bitter as the one 31 years earlier, though not quite as sustained. Elizabeth noted the similarities in her journal, the same stillness in the air, the same crystalline quality to the cold that made every breath visible. She tested the sleeping cupboards one last time, climbing into the larger one with difficulty, feeling the stone warm against her back, remembering Amanda at 4 years old, sleeping soundly, while the world outside tried to freeze everything it touched. On the night of February 15th, with the thermometer reading 40 degrees below zero, Elizabeth climbed into her cupboard for the last time. She'd spent the day organizing papers, writing final notes to Amanda about the cabin's maintenance, updating her journal with the latest temperature readings. She felt the exhaustion that had been building for months, settling over her like a quilt, gentle and inexorable. The stone was warm, the air was still. Everything was exactly as it should be. Amanda found her the next morning, lying peacefully in the cupboard that had kept her safe through 3 decades of Wisconsin winters. The journal opened beside her to a final entry, the 15th of February 1904. Outside, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Main room, plus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Sleeping cupboard, plus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Final sleep. Stone remembered until the end. Below that, in slightly shakier handwriting, Amanda. Continue remembering. Teach them why stone matters. With love, Aunt Beth. They buried her under the oak tree beside Robert Williams and Emily, the graves marked with simple stones that Michael had carved years earlier. Amanda spoke at the funeral about memory and knowledge, about the difference between forgetting and choosing not to remember, about the lives saved by one woman's stubborn insistence that the old ways still worked. 300 people attended, many of them children who'd slept warm because Elizabeth Miller had refused to let winter win. The cabin stayed in the family for 40 years. Amanda's children used it as a summer retreat. Then Amanda's grandchildren, the sleeping cupboards maintained exactly as Elizabeth had built them. In 1944, Amanda herself, now 75 and weakening, made the decision to donate the property to the Wisconsin Historical Society with strict conditions. The cupboards must be preserved, the workshop maintained, the story told to anyone who wanted to hear it. The cabin became a museum in 1947, open to the public from May through October, staffed by volunteers who'd read Amanda's comprehensive documentation and could explain the principles of thermal mass to visitors who arrived curious and left educated. The sleeping cupboards, with their moss insulation replaced 3 times, and their pine boards refinished but their stone and smoke channels exactly as built in 1872, still radiated warmth when the spring sun heated the south-facing chimney. People touched the stone and understood, in a way that words alone could never convey, why this had mattered. Amanda Fletcher died in 1951 at the age of 82, having spent her life teaching that progress wasn't about abandoning old knowledge, but about understanding it deeply enough to improve it. She held 7 patents for heating systems, wrote 3 textbooks on thermal mass design, and trained a generation of engineers who carried the principles forward into an age of central heating and insulated walls. Her obituary in the Milwaukee Journal called her the engineer who remembered when others forgot, a description she would have appreciated. The legacy continued. In the 1970s, as energy crises made Americans reconsider their relationship with heat and fuel, architects rediscovered thermal mass design and began incorporating it into passive solar homes. They called it innovation. The older Norwegian engineers who'd learned from Amanda called it memory. By the 1990s, the sleeping cupboard principle had been adapted into modern passive house designs, straw bale construction, and off-grid building systems. Elizabeth's father's notebook, preserved in a climate-controlled archive, was digitized and made available to researchers worldwide. A young woman visited the Cabin Museum in 2023, a graduate student in sustainable architecture writing her dissertation on traditional heating systems. She stood in front of the larger sleeping cupboard, reading the interpretive sign, then carefully opened the door and peered inside. The interior was clean, well-maintained, the stone still present, the feather tick replaced with a historically accurate reproduction. She reached in, touched the masonry that had kept Elizabeth Miller alive through the winter of 1873, and felt warmth that had nothing to do with any fire burning that day. "It's just solar gain," the museum volunteer explained. "South-facing stone, spring sun, but it still works, still holds heat." The student withdrew her hand, her mind already connecting thermal mass to climate resilience, to energy independence, to the possibility that solutions for the future might be found in the past if people were willing to look. She took photographs, made notes, bought a copy of Amanda Fletcher's textbook from the gift shop. Walking back to her car, she passed the oak tree where 4 people were buried, the stones weathered but legible. Robert Williams, Emily Williams, Elizabeth Miller, Michael Martinez. She paused at Elizabeth's stone, reading the inscription Amanda had chosen. "Stone remembers, wood forgets. She built with what remembers." Below that, dates, and a single line. "Widow, engineer, teacher." She kept her promises. The student stood there for a moment, thinking about her own dissertation, about the professors who dismissed traditional techniques as primitive, about the modern solutions that required constant energy input and failed when the power went out. Elizabeth Miller had built something that worked in 1872 and still worked 150 years later. That wasn't primitive. That was wisdom. Driving away from Pine Valley, the student made a decision that would shape her career. She would study every traditional heating system she could find, from every culture that had faced the problem of survival in cold climates. She would quantify them, test them, improve them where possible, but respect them always. She would remember when her discipline had forgotten. And somewhere, in an archive or a grave or the stones themselves, Elizabeth Miller would approve. The cabin still stands. The chimney still rises. The cupboards still wait. On cold spring mornings when frost lingers in the shadows, volunteers open the museum and find the sleeping cupboards holding warmth from the previous day's sun, exactly as designed, exactly as built, exactly as promised. Stone remembers. It always has. The question was never whether it could save lives, but whether anyone would remember to ask it to try.